This year, International Women's Day comes at a time when our country faces a number of challenges. We have a tough economic environment, which has resulted in severe and worsening fiscal constraints, sustained public budget cuts that curtail services that ultimately impact the most poor and the most vulnerable across our country. The ever-decreasing power of our currency is exacerbating our economic woes, and we face growing inequality and growing poverty. We live in a much more polarized, gender unequal society, one that is increasingly at odds with itself. The environment that we operate in South Africa and beyond is one that is volatile, with geopolitical developments that may easily distract us and even get us to a point where we don't see it fit to recognize and even celebrate days like this. We may even find it difficult to find time and space to celebrate the successes that we've been able to register over time, to celebrate the women that have been our trailblazers. We may even find it difficult to take a moment to ululate in celebration and honor of the women who have shown the way around gender participation at the most crucial tables, and doing so in the face of strong opposition, and always fueled by this revolutionary belief that women are indeed worthy of opportunity. We live in a world and in an age of so-called strong men who have made it a crime to right the wrongs of the past through interventions like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We live in a world where the slaughter of women and children in an attempt to wipe out a whole nation happens in real time, televised, and therefore increasingly normalized. In our world today, cruelty seems to be more prevalent than empathy, kindness, and justice. With the world teetering on the brink of major disagreements, sudden political changes are likely to result in real harm to those that depend on humanitarian aid, and mostly women and their children. The world we find ourselves in militates against the very theme of International Women's Day, which is to accelerate action. It almost feels as if we're entering a period where we are not only decelerating on our journey towards gender equality, but in fact, the gains that we have made since this day was first organized are in real danger of being reversed. The current generation of women leaders may be despairing, may be lamenting, and may be even thinking of giving up. That may be justifiable and reasonable in our current context. However, I'm sure we can all agree that that would be a slap in the face of all the great giants on whose shoulders we do stand as we visualize a gender equal world. It would be a slap in the face for all those activists from the 189 countries who 30 years ago gathered and gifted the world one of the most seminal documents of our time, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Beijing became synonymous with gender activism, and as the declaration suggests, it injected a new spirit of hope and action. It would be lazy and untrue to argue that nothing has changed since then, for it has. It would be equally true to say that the pace, however, has not been as vigorous as intended. According to UN Women, the Beijing Platform for Action, which considers gender equality the basis for all efforts to achieve more peaceful, more prosperous societies and a sustainable planet, has brought tangible results. Governments make commitments that influence domestic and foreign policy and invest in laws. They invest in policies and programs of action to advance gender equality. And then they review the progress made or the lack thereof every 5 years. Some of the progress that's been reported since the Beijing conference include that yes, there are more legal protections for women and girls. whilst there's still a long way to go, there have been laws that have been enacted against the standard around how you advance women and how you protect them, especially against domestic violence and gender-based violence. And it's interesting that some countries are now moving ahead to incorporate into their own legislation and policy protections against new forms of violence linked to technology, such as cyberbullying. We've seen progress in the area of services and support for survivors. Governments have agreed to shelter, provide legal aid, to provide counseling and healthcare for survivors of violence. And these are lifelines that are now accessible in most countries today. More than 100 countries have trained police to support survivors, which is an important step to seeking justice and preventing violence against women. We've seen advances in the area of economic empowerment of women. Gains since 1995 include the nearly global spread of legislation banning gender-based discrimination in employment. New services have emerged to ease women's burden of unpaid care, and gender gaps are closing across the education systems right across the world. These statistics and movements should always be read against the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly SDG 5 and Target 5.8, which urges national governments to undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and national resources, in accordance with national laws. In this 30th year of the Beijing Declaration, it is fitting that we should accelerate our efforts, because the promise of a world in which every woman and girl enjoys full gender equality, and where all legal, social, and economic barriers to their empowerment have been removed, remains unfulfilled. The World Bank estimates, and this is now based on statistics provided in 2022, they estimate that around 2.4 billion women of working age are actually not afforded equal economic opportunities. To be clear, it means that nearly 2.4 billion women globally don't have the same economic rights that men have. And this is not an accident. There are many, many barriers to this. So, my fellow activists and agitators, I do believe that at the heart of advancing gender equality is the ability of women to participate in the financial system that drives the development of families at family level on a smaller level, but also the participation of women in advancing economic development and social development in their countries and across the world. Financial exclusion is still a reality that women face in their daily lives. Half of the world's population is female, and more than half of them are disadvantaged and marginalized. And that means that a sizable percentage of people that should be contributing positively to the economy and the country's development are being denied the right and opportunity to do so. And that's where the biggest challenge lies. It was not only until recently that women could open a bank account, even in this country, without the acquiescence of their husbands. And perhaps women of my generation and even younger forget that it was our own mothers and grandmothers who couldn't do that. They couldn't buy land, and they couldn't do so many things that we take for granted today. So the journey of driving financial inclusion for women must continue. For you and I have been able to experience firsthand the benefits of being able to earn your own salary, buy your own property, buy your own assets, and make choices and decisions that affect you with a clarity of mind around what you prefer. So financial inclusion is something we have to continue to agitate for. First, it's about access. The World Bank says that it's about reducing barriers to economic participation. Financial services equip women with tools and resources to start and grow their businesses. It allows them to manage their household finances and to invest in their own futures. strengthens their voices in decisions that affect them, and it narrows gender pay gaps as well as gender gaps in terms of access to financial capital. Financial inclusion supports entrepreneurship and business growth, bringing more people and enterprises into the formal economy. And in other words, it's in the interest of development, of country development and economic growth that we drive the inclusion of women, because they're the ones who will open up businesses and employ people, and especially in a country like ours, in a continent like ours, where inclusion of people into the formal economy is something that we still have to deal with. Access to credit and capital, secure savings, and efficient payment services enable small businesses to expand. It enables them to create jobs and drive economic development. And access to insurance enhances resilience by offering protection against unforeseen risks and financial shocks, providing individuals with a peace of mind and allowing entrepreneurs to undertake ventures, to take risks with much greater confidence. We've seen a number of successful female entrepreneurs redefine the landscape. We've seen a number of people inspire us with their success. You need look no further than the World Development Bank, Wiphold, but I'd like to focus on a particular story, that of Mam Daphne Mashilo-Nkosi. She and a cohort of women founded Kalahari Manganese, and they've played an important role in mining, encouraged and aided by progressive national legislation that provided a basis for access for gender-neutral economic activity in that space. And once in the driving seat, Sis Daphne ensured that women were in meaningful positions, starting with the board. In fact, we hear that her insistence on women taking their rightful place is cited as the reason why at one stage she was stripped of her own directorship, which fortunately and justly was subsequently restored. Thanks to her vision and investment in communities, today the famous Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital is one of the recipients of a hematology oncology center. So I tell this story to highlight just what impact giving women opportunities can actually have, not just on their own lives or on the businesses they're dealing with directly, but can have in terms of driving better lives for other people as well. The Beijing Plan of Action calls for each nation, each government and jurisdiction to develop a plan of action, one that changes the status quo, which means that they had to adapt their policies, draw up new ones, and deliver so that they could deliver on this specific commitment. So countries have many policies, laws, plans to drive change. Our country is no different. However, equally important, if not more so, countries must have leaders and institutions that can implement those plans and policies and laws in the way that is intended. Advocacy is one thing. Agitating for the establishment of institutions that will implement those policies, I believe, is more critical and more urgent. Advocating for institutions led by people who are aligned to the vision, who are ethical and responsible and responsive and accountable and transparent about what they're doing is probably more urgent. Ensuring that we've got institutions that will give effect to the promises that come when we ululate at the signing of a program of action. That becomes much more important. It's not lost to me that the story of Mam Daphne would probably have been very different, even with the same policies, had we had different leaders. I'm not sure it's an accident that the department that was charged with implementing those policies was led by Sis Phumzile, who was the minister then. I'm also alert to the idea that the president of the country is an ally for gender equality. The president at the time, who was responsible for giving effect to these policies, is an ally for gender equality and saw fit to ensure that those policies were implemented to good effect. Imagine how much further we'd be on implementing our good policies if we had worried just as much about policy as we do about who's going to implement them and which institutions we rely on. I must say, implementing policy must cut both ways. There's the private sector and the public sector. You've got to worry about institutions in both. But because I spend my time and energy and focus in the public sector, that's where my worry is. One of the things I think we will be consistently disappointed with ourselves for, and will continue to lament about, is the fact that we've not invested enough attention and consistent effort in building public sector institutions. We establish policies and we ululate when that happens, and that's correct. But somehow we seem to be then surprised when those policies aren't implemented. And yet we've taken our own eye off the ball in terms of who's implementing them. So I'll tell you what I see. When we issue audit outcomes, and I have to get there, I am the Auditor General. What we do is we audit financial statements, right? So the accountants and auditors in the room will tell you there's a process through which you technically look at the financial statements, and what you say is whether or not those financial statements can be relied upon. And it's important because if somebody can't produce financial statements that can't be relied upon, it means they don't have the financial management disciplines that are necessary. So it's important, that's one tick. The second thing we look at is whether or not the performance report, that report where they tell you what they've actually done with the money, and they show whether or not that's consistent with what was agreed when the money was put into the hands of those stewards, whether or not that report can be relied upon. That's important. And then we look at whether or not the law is being complied with. And that's when the financial statements are credible, performance report is credible, and there are no non-compliances, then we say there's a clean audit. So I know that people in the private sector often ask, what is this thing about a clean audit? Why don't you just worry about financial statements? Here's the thing. In the public sector, we must worry about whether or not the money is being used to the effect we intended. Our attention is not merely on the bottom line. Our attention is not merely on whether or not the cash flow statement balances, as important as that is. Crucial that we have a conversation about how was our policy implemented? How were the objectives we gave actually met or not met? Then you can have an accountability conversation. And then we say, have you complied with the law? So when we say as the Audit Office, there are so few clean audits, I invite you to read into that we do not yet have a dominance of institutions in the public sector that comply with the rule of law. I invite you to remember that what it tells you is that we have not yet built a system where the things we hope for and promise through legislative means have a likelihood of being implemented. In South Africa, we've made major gains in terms of legislation on gender equality and all those pillars we spoke about. We've made tremendous gains. And then we advocate for procurement, public procurement, to be done in a manner that's going to deliver benefits to black people and especially black women. And then we keep wondering why that promise isn't delivered? The simple answer I can offer is that we've not yet invested in building the capability to implement our policies. So the next time someone says, I have an unqualified audit, I think you're allowed to smile, but I'm not sure you should applaud. Because it tells you that that person, for as long as they're unable to show you that they have the systems, the disciplines, the practices, the capability to implement policy, they're not going to meet your expectations. They're not likely to deliver on what we've all agreed is important. In Agenda 2063, the continent committed itself to full gender equality in all spheres of life, by ensuring that all obstacles related to women owning or inheriting property or business, signing a contract, owning or managing a bank account would be removed by 2023. And there are some impediments that prevented women from taking part in the economy, and that's why these specific items were identified through Agenda 2063. And sadly, the lot of women in this regard hasn't changed as quickly as what was intended. As we sit in 2025, we're still quite far from what we had hoped for. Some progress, yes, and the statistics show us that there has been progress. But if we track across the continent and if we look at the different regions, we're still not meeting what we'd hoped for. There are some good examples. An example is in Lesotho, where the conversion of land tenure from customary to registered leases created opportunities for women to secure land. And now, before the Land Act of 2010, 73% of leases in Lesotho were registered to men only. But with the advent of this act, women now hold 34% of the leases, while joint registration by men and women stands at 25%. So maybe you can add half of the 25 to the 34. That's significant progress in a fairly short space of time. By any measure, we must agree that we are still far from where we want to be. However, we know that where there is a will and where there's capacity to implement, change is possible. The Beijing Declaration, and as we think about Beijing 30, the Beijing Declaration was a call to action for women and girls to be treated fairly, a call to action which I believe is still valid today. We are now called upon to ensure that we increase the pace of gender equality and remove stumbling blocks for women to play a full role in the economy. And like Sis Daphne, those in positions of authority need to ensure access. And once doors have been opened, we know women do take their rightful places. Study after study shows that there's still significant dominance by men in the financial services sector, with 8% of CEOs being female. One that we celebrated together just about a year ago, Mary Bilagazi, who took on the leadership of First Rand. Only 22% of CEOs in financial services are female, according to a 2022 study by PwC. This is another picture that reminds us that legislation and policy alone won't get us there. And I talked about institutional capacity, and I know I spoke a lot more about the public sector, but it shows you that even in the private sector, we have to continue to agitate and get the implementation of policies that have all been agreed. I happen to have real experience in our institution at the Office of the Auditor General of how, through allyship, through policy, through decisive and consistent attention, we've been able to transform the institution. Through the work of my predecessors, former AGs, who are male, by the way, and through the work of many in the institution, we've now got an Auditor General of South Africa that, yes, has 4,000 people that work there on a full-time basis, including 1,000 chartered accountants. Okay, I'll say it again. 1,000 fully qualified chartered accountants. Because if you know the profession, you know how important that is. Most of them female, more than 50%. And most of them African females, by the way. What we've done over many years is we've implemented a bursary program that allows financial access for young people who want to go to university. We then work with the universities to ensure that they're supported throughout their academic studies. We then have a training program that allows them to get their on-the-job training while they work in our office. And it is the largest graduate training program that has been accredited by the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Thank you. Same program you would find in any of the auditing firms that you would interact with in the private sector. What excites me most about this program now is, yes, over time we've helped almost 3,000, more than 2,000, but I think we're getting close to 3,000 now of people who've been able to qualify as CAs having been trained through the office. But wait for it, I have to tell you this. This you gotta get, right? So now, the Office of the AG every year delivers into the market fully qualified CAs who have passed the SAICA board exams, the same ones that are written by everybody else. Almost 300 people every year qualifying as new chartered accountants. To put that number into perspective, we are this year number 3 behind 2 of the big firms, with the other firms behind us. It's one of the things that excites me because it tells us that not only are we creating opportunities for young people who come and train and get their designation, and then they go on to do wonderful things. Yes, some stay, but they go on to work in the public sector, in the private sector, and globally. But the other thing that excites me is we can demonstrate to the world, but importantly to South Africans, that a public sector institution can be just as good as a private sector. In our small way, we are asserting that young black people, young black women, most of them are, they can do anything they set their minds on. And they can achieve anything in the world as long as they're willing to work for it. And we are asserting that if you give people opportunity, they'll take their rightful place in society. And that's what we're doing in our small firm. Being intentional about developing talent is a major contribution we can all make in driving the inclusion of women in the economy, the ability to access capital and to generate capital, the ability to make decisions for themselves, about themselves, for their families, about their families, and for their society. By driving the professionalization of our office, we've been able to demonstrate that. And what we are seeing is that even other supreme audit institutions, our peers, especially those in the region, which we work with directly because we drive capacity building for other AGs across the continent, we're seeing that they are also more and more, just like us, worrying about how they drive inclusion in their work environment through policies and action and accountability for those actions. We're also seeing them worry more and more about how they engage with their own auditees, their own governments, in driving different conversations beyond the debits and credits to a conversation about how do you, as a public institution, give effect to the policies that we've all agreed upon. And I believe that that's one of the crucial contributions that supreme audit institutions can make in the journey towards building lives, in the journey towards developing countries and economies. So you may have expected me to talk a lot more about financial inclusion, but I hope you see the thread. To my mind, we can have a policy and worry about how people can open bank accounts and access insurance. But if we don't invest in worrying about what happens in different institutions, especially public sector institutions, we're not going to get the benefits associated with all the good work we do on advocacy. So in your dialogue today, I hope I've given you some provocation that you can include as you figure out how you're going to drive better advances on gender equality in a world that's troubled. My short answer, after all I've said, it's about building strong, accountable, transparent, effective institutions, especially in the public sector. Whether it's about financial inclusion, whether it's about worrying about the environment and the impact of climate change on women, especially women, across our continent. And as I conclude, I'd like to say that we all need to pick up the pace, especially in the face of growing opposition to what we would want to see. We must not be deterred by the noise. We must not get discouraged when we see people moving a few steps back. I believe wholeheartedly that progress is evident, and that's enough to inspire us to keep moving. And I believe that if we focus our attention more and more on who's implementing these policies on our behalf and how are they implementing these policies, we'll make much greater gains, even in the current complexity. I'd like to close by quoting former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, who said that future generations will judge us not by what we say, but by what we do. We need to accelerate our actions and empower girls and women for a better world. It's in our small, individual, and collective actions that will bring about change. We cannot wait for others to come along and do it for us. We have to do it. Unfortunately, women tend to roll up the sleeves and get it done. And we certainly don't need to wait for permission to be granted to us. Thank you.
Wow. Wow.